Alright, so welcome to this Implicit Shape tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to cover how you can deal with the implicit shape and shaders and some of the power that you have with data channels. So I'm just going to play back this basic render here. This is just default scanline render with some colors and some basic shaders. Just to illustrate what we're going to do here, I wanted to keep it very simple and very straightforward to illustrate what is happening. Okay, so you can see this is kind of a very cheap and terrible lava effect. However, it's going to illustrate how you use the data channels and also how you use them in the implicit shape to manipulate your shaders. So you can see very quickly here we have a matte sort of finish. We also have a glossy finish here. We also have color changes based on how fast the particles are moving. You can see that very easily here, which is very nice. And this is all done with one shader, and you can do a very complex shader. This is using default 3ds Max scanline materials, but you can also use this with V-Ray or any other shaders. This is just how you're going to drive your effects. So let's get into it. So I have the scene here, and if I play it down, you'll see basically we have particles emitting from a sphere object that's hitting a torus knot. And then what we also have is our flow solver, which is doing the fluid sim. And eventually then from underneath the floor here, what we're going to have is a box rising, which is freezing and basically doing a group change switch. And that freezes the particles. Alright, so that's what we're going to deal with. Now we're going to talk about the implicit shape and setting up shaders and so on. So just to run you quickly through the thinking particle tree here. Basically what we have here is a fluid master, we have fluid frozen, we have a gravity, and fluid 1. Very simple. We're birthing from a matter waves, which is the sphere. We are going to give it a start color. Then we have gravity, which is on. And then in the freeze rule, basically what we're doing is we're taking that fluid, we're using an in-mesh test, which is that box that's rising from the ground, and it's freezing that and also zeroing out the velocity and then sending it to this fluid frozen group. Okay. Once that happens, then we're going to go ahead and set up a rule in here, which will then take the fluid that's frozen and change its colors and parameters as well. And then this is just the flow group and the flow group solver. And in Mesh, this is what the tutorial is about, which is the implicit shape and how you deal with shading and driving using particle data to drive your shaders. So let's resize the TP window here so we can actually see what's happening. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to turn on our mesh here so we can just play that down and see that we have the mesh in the viewport. At this point, we don't really need to see the particles at all, so I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. And I'm also going to turn off edit on the fly. I'm going to bring up the material editor. So the material that we're going to use is called fluid base, and again, like I said, it's a standard 3ds Max material. And we're going to go into our implicit shape here. And our implicit shape, we're going to go ahead and connect that to our fluid 1, which is our first set of fluid here. That's going to be using the implicit shape. And we are going to then just drag this material right over to our implicit shape as an instance. I'll close the material editor down. So now if I play this back, we're just going to see basically our fluid being meshed, and that's all we need to see for right now. And down below here we have our fluid assigned. We have our data to mapping channels roll out here. This is the one that's important because you have a UVW data channel at the top, color channel, and then multiple vector channels. And the reason for that is allowing you to drive shader parameters. So what we're doing is we're using a basic 3ds Max standard material, and we're going to drive the diffuse color, the self-illumination, and also the specularity. So the diffuse color right now, we're not seeing anything in the viewport. It's not green, even though the shader you see it's green. That's because when we play down TP here, if I stop it for a second, if I select Thinking Particles and right-click and go to Object Properties, you'll notice that we're set to display the vertex channel information and map channel color. Okay, so what we're doing is we're actually using vertex color along with the data channel mapping to display color information. Okay. So first of all, here to discuss this, we're going to change the diffuse color. So let's get started with that. The first thing I'm going to do is I need to create a data channel that also corresponds to what we're doing in the implicit shape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to our fluid master, because everything underneath is going to receive that data channel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead here and call this Diff Color. That's for diffuse color. And again, depends on what kind of data type you need to choose here. And because we're going to be manipulating the RGB color value, one of the mistakes is you could just choose color here, but that's not really what you would want to do if you want to manipulate the RGB value of like, let's say, a bitmap or something like that. In this case, what we're actually going to do is we're going to use a color helper inside TP. So we're actually going to use the color data type. Okay, so because we're manipulating the diffuse color itself inside TP with a helper color operator, we can use the color type. If this was a bitmap image in here that we wanted to display basically on our shader, on our implicit shape, so that it moves with the surface and whatnot, then we would want to choose a 0.3 type, which is RGB. Okay. So the first thing is we just created a diffuse color data channel, which is channel 0. In our shader now, in the diffuse, we're going to go ahead and we're going to assign a vertex color, and we're going to use map channel 1. Okay. So now we're using map channel 1, but our data channel is 0. Okay, very important. Next thing I'm going to do is go to our implicit shape, and we're going to use the first thing here is your data channel, and the next thing is what map channel ID. So our data channel is channel 0, so I'm going to type in 0. Our map ID is map channel 1. Okay. So now what I need to do in color start, I need to basically set up the rule that is going to give us a color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to resize this window a bit. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and grab fluid 1, and I'm going to add a operator called particle data. So I'm going to hit tab and type in particle, and we want to use the particle data operator. This will allow us to basically see our data channels in here. So if I choose fluid 1, we're going to see that we have a diffuse data channel in here. So I'm going to connect this here. So basically from the start of our fluid, why this dynamic set's called start color, we're going to give the particle, the implicit shape, just a base color for the diffuse of that shader. To do so, we're going to use a helper called basically color. So let's go ahead and drop that in here. So the color operator is just that. It's basically like the diffuse color swatch here in your shader, right? It's very basic. Now I can feed out color information like this, but we want a solid color going directly into our diffuse color data channel. And let's say I want to give that a let's give it a blue color just to start out with. Okay, if I close this down now, we play this back in the viewport, you'll see that our particles are now blue. Okay, so that is a very basic setup for getting diffuse color to be driven from thinkingParticles into your shader. If I render this now, all the particles are going to be blue on that implicit shape. Now later on, as these particles will freeze when that box rises from the floor and all the fluids start to freeze, you'll see that the implicit shape is still blue. That's because this is just our starting point of what we're going to do. So we're going to do a little bit differently than the video that you just saw in the beginning of the tutorial, but all the aspects of it we're going to cover. So our first fluid type here is going to be just basically a blue fluid like that. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to go into the shader here, and I want to control that self-illumination, okay? Because right now, as I play this down, our self-illumination is something that I'd want to happen based on some velocity parameters. So let's do that. Let's set that up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically copy this and I'm going to paste it down below. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I don't need the color in here anymore because we already have that established up above. This is a little bit of a different rule that we want to set up. So I want to basically test the output velocity of this fluid. And I want to check that against a threshold value. And there's multiple ways to do this sort of stuff. This is kind of basic thinking particles stuff, which is rule-based tests like this. And what I need now is a different data type, because in the shader for self-illumination, we're going to be controlling basically 0 to 100 here in the spinner. Okay, so we need a different data type for that. So we need to create another data channel. In the fluid master here, I'm going to go ahead and call this glow, because that's essentially what we're going to do is we're going to make glowing. And this isn't a color type because we need basically an RGB value that gets illuminated by 0 to 100. So we need a 0.3 value. Okay, so we'll say add. So now channel 1 is using a 3-point value, and you can see here that data type shows up. So I also need to create a 0.3 value inside thinking particles. So this is again a vector, right? If I go to the implicit shape, down below we have UVW color, which we're already using, and then multiple vectors. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this vector and we're going to say basically 1. 1 is equal to 100 in the self-illumination of the shader. So you can think of this as percentages. So this means it's going to be basically 100% self-illuminated when this rule tests true. So I'm going to connect the vector to our data channel called glow. What I'm going to do is I'm going to test it against the velocity of these particles and then send the output to this rule. What I'm going to do is say when you're inside these values here, go ahead and make this rule true. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this and just kind of disable this for right now. What I want to find out is what are the particles actually traveling at? What's their speed? So I'm going to turn off the mesh here for a second and turn on just ticks so we can see the particles in the viewport. And I can get an idea of what's the range of velocity that we're dealing with in these particles. So I'll just stop it at a couple of frames here. What I'm going to use is inside Thinking Particles in the master dynamic, there's this great tool called Show Info Tooltip. I'm going to click on that, and that allows me to basically click on our particles and get basic information right out of the gate by clicking on these particles. So if I want to get position, if I want to get spin, all these different channels, I can see that quickly. So all I really want is velocity and what group. So I can see the ones here down at the ground that actually impact the ground. Once they kind of settle on the ground, they're anywhere between 6, 10, kind of low values. As they're getting close to the floor, they're about 173, 145, so 170 something. At the beginning, when they're just getting born off that matter waves object, they're 40, 20, so they're very low values when they first ramp out, and then as they start to, you can see here the velocity increases from gravity pulling it down. So what I could say is maybe from 100 to 170, I can give it a range of where I want it to glow. So what we can do is we can set that value in here. So let me just rearrange this a little bit here quickly just so we can see this. So we'll go ahead and turn on our rule here, and I want it to be inside, let's say, a value of 300, and I want it to start at like 100. So from 100 to 300, this is the range where that data channel called glow is going to be a maximum value of 1. So this would be like when the fluid is hot. So I can name that hot just so we can kind of see that. So if I play this down now, let's see the implicit shape here. And let's turn off our particles because we don't actually need to display them. If I play this down now, what we're going to see basically is our blue particles again. And what we need to get our self-illumination working is we need two things. We need first, in the self-illumination channel of our shader, we need to add a vertex color. And I need to set it to a different map channel. So I'm going to use map channel 2. Okay. In our implicit shape, we need to set up that information as well. So we are using map channel 0, or data channel 0, sorry. So data channel 0 is for our color. Our vector channel is going to be channel 1, because that's the next data channel that we created, and we're using map channel 2. If I play this down now, what we're going to see basically is we're going to see our blue particles, right? And what I want to see is I want to see if this rule is being evaluated here and if it's working. So let's make sure that our data channel is set. So channel 1, and we are using vector channel 1 and mapping ID 2. Great. So in order to see this, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a default render here with a really small resolution, and I'm going to set the active range here just to render out a bunch of frames. And this data isn't going to be saved anywhere, but this is just for me to see whether or not this is actually working. And you can see clearly by the glow that's now being applied from that self-illumination channel that we're actually seeing that happen. Okay. So if I play this down the viewport, it would be great if we could see that self-illumination actually happening as well in here. And unfortunately, it's either displaying basically your vertex channel shaded or not. So you don't actually get to see the glow that's actually happening here, which is fine. What we can also do, though, at the same time, just to see that visually here, is we can also change the color, which is what you kind of saw in the video. So let's go ahead and do that as well. So what we're going to do is we're also going to change the diffuse color when it's hot. So let's go ahead and make a copy by just doing shift here. And we're going to change that from blue to, let's say, red. And we're going to plug that into diffuse color. Now what this will do is this will also show up directly in the viewport because we're showing vertex color information. While we won't see the glow, we can see clearly, though, that the color is changing from blue to red. Now if you can imagine it, that red area is also going to be 100% self-illuminated. So it gives you a visual feedback here in the viewport as well. If I render this now, we would see what we saw before, but it would be red. So if I just change this again, just so we can kind of see a quick render. And yes, we are not saving any frames, just so you can see that it's going to go from blue to red at 100% self-illuminated. So this is where you can start setting rules and values using the implicit shape and data channels. So remember, when you want to control spinner information, such as like the self-illumination channel, you're going to need to make sure that you use a 0.3, which is a vector. And then if you're manipulating color information like we're doing here, color swatches, you know, like in the shader, then you're going to want to use a color helper in TP, like what we're doing. So if we wanted to manipulate the specularity, which is what you saw in the video, we can do that as well. So what I'm going to do is go inside Thinking Particles here, So you can see right now we can set up basic rules with these two data channels, one for diffuse color and one for the glow, which is a 0.3 value. And keep in mind, again, I just want to illustrate the diffuse color that we're using here is using a color helper inside TP to drive it. What we're also using is that 0.3 value, that vector value, to drive that self-illumination channel inside our shader. Just as we're doing that here in a simple 3ds Max default standard shader, this can be done to a V-Ray shader, any other shader that you want to manipulate these data types of the shader using that data channel that you create in thinkingParticles and then also the implicit shape. So if we want to create another one, we can do that, and that'll allow us to manipulate also the specularity. So right now you can see that we have a very sharp specular highlight here. If I just bring this down to like 2, 5, 25, you can see that we're controlling that. And we can do that as well, which you saw in the video. So again, all we need to do is create another data channel. So what we're going to do is basically we're going to copy this and we're going to go to our end color, which is what we have here. And so I'm just going to paste that in here quickly and get rid of this stuff, and we're going to take the color and we're going to change that to a completely different color. So let's just make that almost a dark blue color like this and plug that into our diffuse color. And again, this is based on a threshold here, and when the group changes it will go from that blue to the red, which is the glowing material. And when the box rises, as it's changing the groups, it's also going to be changing that diffuse color again. But what we're going to do is we're also going to change the specularity of our base shader. So as this starts to create that dark blue matter that's rising up from our basic in-mesh test here, which again, you can do any kind of testing and manipulation. This is just an example just to clearly show the workflow and how this works. So what we'll do is, instead of controlling, well, we could also control the glow as well. So we could go down here and we could copy our paste here. We could affect the glow channel, and we could give that a very small glow value if we wanted to, like this, or we could just zero it out. Okay, really depends on what you want to do. So in this case, we're just going to go ahead and zero that out. But what we're going to create is a new data channel, control the specular level. Okay, so let's go to our fluid master, and we're going to create a spec, and that is a 0.3 data type, because we need, basically, it's a spinner that's controlling it, right? So this spinner information, so keep that in mind. If it's a spinner that you type in values in the shader, then you're going to need a 0.3. So that 0.3 now is data channel 2, and you see it shows up here. So what we're going to do is, for our spec, we're going to rename this to spec, and we're going to plug that into our data channel here, and we'll give it a small specular value of like 0.2. 0.2 is a equation to 20, so if I do 20, this is the specularity that we're going to get when this rule tests true. Okay, so bring this back up to 100. Okay, now what we need to do is we need to take that newly created data channel, which is data channel 2, and we need to assign that 2 places. We need to add a vertex color here to our specularity level. So we're going to use a vertex color. Important thing to note is to make sure you give it a different map channel. If you don't give it a different map channel, chances are you'll probably end up just crashing max. But you need to give it a different map channel. Okay, so we're doing map channel 3. So then in our implicit shape here, what I'm going to do is go down to the bottom here, and we're already using the first vector channel, so we have another vector channel we can use, and that's going to be our second data channel and map channel 3. Okay, So I'm going to zoom in here like this, and I'll play this down. So in the shader, we have a very specular material that has a very hot spec to make it look glossy in the beginning. Then when our box that comes up from the floor, which is using the InMesh test, that's going to also use that data channel that we just created to change the specularity level. Okay, so if I stop this on a frame like such, notice here in the viewport down here below we have very hot specularity because it's not changing in the viewport, but I'll render this frame so we can actually see it. So if I render this frame, what we're going to see is that at the bottom we're going to have that darker blue material, but the specularity will not be at 100, it will be at 20. You can't see that in the viewport, but at render time you'll be able to verify that. And you can also verify it just by knowing that your color has changed. So if you are plugging in a different type into your data channels in that rule, you can see them in the viewport that they've changed. So I move this off to the side here. You'll see that while at the top we have a this is glowing though. We have a very specular material, but down below the spec is much less than it is in the beginning. So what we can do is we can also set that to very clearly illustrate that. So when we start this, we're also going to give our specularity at the beginning very hot spec. So let's name this spec, and let's plug that into our specularity channel here just to make sure that our spec, when we start out here, it's going to be at 1, which is 100%. And then when we end our specularity, let's make it a 0.1 value. So there's very small specularity component to that shader. And I'll go ahead and play this down again, and just once we get to a frame where we start to see that, I'll stop it right now and render a frame so we can see the hot spec that will be on our material here, right? Even on the beginning, before it starts glowing and everything like that, we see the spec. And then when we continue on and we get the box rising, we're not going to have that same hot spec because we already set the spec in the beginning to be a value of 1, which is 100%. And then that way, once the box starts to rise up to the top, we're doing a value of 0.1, which is about 10%. So I'll go ahead and stop it after a frame, maybe one more frame, something like that. And then I'll render this frame so we can see that we won't have that hot spec in the area that we have that's compared to the other part of the shader, which is still going to be at 100% on that data channel. So I'll let this render through very quickly. And you can clearly see that its specularity is much grander at the top versus the matte sort of look that we get down at the bottom. And that's due to the data channels that we're using and the data channels that we're setting inside the implicit shape, and also the vertex color maps that we're using inside of our shaders. So that is a very quick way to manipulate your shaders using the implicit shape and vertex color. At the same time that we're doing this with a standard 3ds Max material, we could also use this to drive a blend material. So for right now, if you think about this, we're choosing to manipulate color information inside TP, which is what we're doing here with the color helper, and then using a 3-point value, which is a vector value. We're using that to drive the specularity, also the self-illumination. And by giving it standard rules inside of TP, we're able to control our shader based on the behavior of our particles. I could also change this to a blend material. And I could have 2 different shaders in here. And in my mask, what I could do is actually put in a vertex color. And that vertex color to use for the mask here could be a data channel between black and white. So there's multiple things that you can do in order to drive these shaders, whether you're driving specifically the colors, values, your blend materials, whether you're doing it for displacement, specularity. There's all kinds of different things you can use to manipulate your materials. So hopefully you find this a very useful tutorial on how you work with data channels and the implicit shape. Thanks for watching.